The war that had consumed the world was finally collapsing into its bloody end. Across Europe, the battlefields had fallen silent one by one, and the once unshakable German war machine now lay in ruins. Cities smouldered, families were scattered, and soldiers, once proud and unyielding, were reduced to prisoners of a conflict they could no longer control. Among them were women, German female prisoners of war, captured and marched into Allied custody. They had carried with them the weight of defeat, the bitterness of loss, and the gnawing ache of hunger that grew more unbearable with each passing day. For days they had eaten nothing. Their stomachs tightened against the void, their bodies weak and trembling under the strain. Hunger is not just the absence of food, it is a slow unraveling of the human spirit. And when the moment finally came, when these German women, worn down by war and despair, were offered food by their captors, their iron discipline crumbled. They were no longer soldiers, no longer defiant, no longer bound by pride. In that instant, they were human again, fragile, desperate, and overwhelmed by the simplest act of mercy. Tears welled in their eyes. Their hands shook as they reached for the bread, the soup, the sustenance that meant survival. For them, this was not just food. It was life given back. This is the story of that moment, the day German female POWs broke down as they were given food after days of hunger. They sat in silence, a silence heavy enough to drown even the memory of voices. These were not the proud soldiers of the Reich the world had once been told to fear, nor the defiant women who had sworn loyalty to a cause now shattered into dust. These were prisoners, stripped of power, stripped of certainty, stripped of dignity, and above all, stripped of food. Their uniforms, once sharp and pressed, were now nothing but tattered rags, clinging to skin, pulled thin by hunger. Their boots were scuffed, their hair clung in greasy strands against hollowed cheeks, and their eyes, sunken deep into sockets, carried a shadow that only starvation can cast. Days had passed since anything of substance had crossed their lips. Each heartbeat was an echo of weakness, each breath a struggle between holding on and letting go. The camp was quiet that day, save for the creak of boots on frozen ground, the distant clang of metal gates, and the occasional bark of an order shouted in English by their captors. The women sat lined along a long bench outside a makeshift hall, their bodies folded inward, conserving what little strength remained. The sky above was grey and pitiless, the kind of sky that gave no warmth, no promise of sunlight, only the reminder of cold air gnawing against fragile bodies. Their hands rested limply in their laps, fingers thin, nails cracked. They did not speak, for speech was too costly. It drained what they could no longer spare. And yet in the silence, their hunger roared louder than any words could. Then it came, the smell. At first faint, drifting through the air like a whisper of hope. A smell so ordinary in times of peace, yet so powerful now that it seemed almost divine. The faint aroma of bread, the steam of boiling broth, the sizzle of something cooking over flame. The women lifted their heads, some in disbelief, others with a sudden sharpness in their gaze that had long been absent. Eyes darted toward the source, untrusting, unsure if their minds were betraying them. Hunger had played tricks before, conjuring illusions in the haze of weakness. But this was real. Allied soldiers emerged carrying trays, metal pots, and loaves of bread wrapped in cloth. Steam rose in tendrils into the cold air, curling like smoke from a holy fire. In that instant, the atmosphere shifted. The silence broke, not with words, but with breaths that quickened, with throats that tightened, with hands that instinctively clenched as though to prepare for what might be theirs. The women's faces, hardened by discipline and despair, cracked under the weight of sudden hope. Tears welled in eyes too dry from days without water. Pride, that last fragile shield they had carried into captivity, trembled on the brink of collapse. The soldiers approached without cruelty. Their expressions were stern, measured, but not unkind. They set down the trays, the bowls, the loaves of bread, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to freeze. The women stared. Their hunger screamed for them to move, to leap forward, to grab what was in front of them. But fear, shame, and the memory of dignity held them still. It was as if their very souls hesitated to believe. Could mercy truly come in the form of their enemy? Could food, the one thing their bodies demanded, also be the thing to undo them completely? The first to break was a young woman, her face pale and streaked with dirt. She reached out, hesitant, her hand trembling violently as it hovered over the bread before pulling back as though ashamed. But hunger overpowered hesitation. With a sob that cracked her dry lips, she took the piece offered to her. The moment it touched her hands, her resolve shattered. She pressed it to her mouth and bit down, her tears falling freely now, dripping onto the crust as she chewed. The sound of her muffled sobs carried through the line, and one by one, others followed. Some tried to maintain composure, taking their rations carefully, bowing their heads in an attempt to hide their faces as tears escaped. Others broke openly, weeping as they accepted bowls of soup, the steam rising into their faces as if to remind them that life had not completely abandoned them. The first spoonfuls burned their tongues, too hot for mouths unused to food, but they didn't care. Each bite, each sip, was both agony and salvation. Their pride crumbled faster than the bread in their hands, and with every tear the camp became filled with the sound of humanity returning. Not the defiant shouts of battle, not the rigid silence of prisoners, but the raw, unfiltered cries of people whose suffering had found a momentary end. Hunger had reduced them to shadows, and now food, simple bread, simple broth, was restoring them piece by piece. Their shoulders shook as sobs overtook them, some collapsing onto the benches, others clutching the bowls as though they were treasures. Their hands trembled so violently that soup spilled onto the dirt, but they did not care. Even the dirt was sacred if food touched it. The Allied guards stood back, some averting their eyes out of respect, others watching with quiet solemnity. They knew what they were witnessing was not just the act of feeding the hungry. It was the breaking of chains, the collapse of facades, the tearing away of whatever remained of enemy or soldier. In that moment, the women were nothing more than human beings, fragile and suffering, finally touched by mercy. The scene lingered in the cold air, etched into the memory of all who witnessed it. A war had brought these women here. Ideologies had shaped their choices, their uniforms, their captivity. But hunger had stripped all of that away. And now food, just food, had reduced them to tears, made them human again. The act of eating became the act of survival, and in survival they found something greater than pride, the chance to live another day. They had known hunger before, long before they were prisoners. As the Reich began to crumble, rations at home had grown smaller, supplies had grown thinner, and the once proud nation had been reduced to scraps. But the hunger in captivity was different. It was sharper, colder, more merciless. Days blended into nights, with no food to mark the passage of time. Their bodies, deprived of sustenance, seemed to fold in on themselves. Conversations became shorter, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the effort of speaking drained strength they no longer had. Even whispers were costly, and so silence reigned. Hunger had a way of taking dignity piece by piece. At first, they shared with one another, breaking off crumbs, passing small portions to those who seemed weaker, mothers offering bites to daughters, friends trying to protect each other. But eventually there was nothing left to share. Each prisoner was reduced to her own private war against emptiness. They scavenged when they could, scraping bowls long since licked clean, searching pockets for forgotten crusts, chewing on bitter roots if they were lucky enough to find them. Even the act of imagining food became torture. The smell of burning wood was enough to conjure memories of bread ovens from home, the sight of muddy water enough to make them dream of soups they would never taste. Hunger had no pity. It stripped away the illusions of strength. Some women stared into the distance unblinking, their minds adrift in feverish dreams. Others curled tightly against the cold walls of the barracks, shivering not only from weather, but from the weakness that gripped their frames. And then came the moment that changed everything. Soldiers appeared carrying trays and bowls, steam rising in white ribbons into the grey air. Bread loaves wrapped in cloth, broth so hot that it fogged the glass of their goggles as they walked. For the prisoners it was unthinkable. Their captors, their enemies, bringing food. At first they could not process it. Was it a trick? A cruel gesture meant to break them further? Yet the smell was undeniable, the warmth unmistakable. For days, their bodies had been empty vessels, and now salvation came in the most unexpected form. The women's eyes followed every movement as bowls were set down, their gazes locked not on the men who carried them, but on the food itself. It was no longer about politics, nations, or sides in a war. It was about survival, about one instinct stronger than all others, to eat, to live. The act of eating became something far more than filling bellies. It was a bridge between despair and endurance, between past and present. Yesterday, they had been on battlefields or behind wire fences, defined by roles forced upon them: enemy, prisoner, soldier. Today, in the steam of soup and the crust of bread, they were something else. Just women, just humans, just beings clinging to life. The contrast was so overwhelming that many broke down before they even tasted the food. They held bowls in their hands, staring into them with disbelief, as if they were looking into a miracle. The broth reflected tired faces, eyes swollen with tears, lips trembling. Some murmured words that sounded like prayers. Others sat frozen, afraid to break the fragile spell of mercy by taking the first bite. When the spoons finally lifted, there was hesitation, then surrender. The first mouthful was fire and comfort all at once. It scalded their throats, too hot for bodies that had forgotten what nourishment felt like. But they welcomed the pain. It was proof that this was real, that they were alive enough to feel. Some wept as they ate, the tears mixing with the broth running down their cheeks unchecked. Others closed their eyes tightly, shutting out the world, focusing only on the taste, on the warmth spreading through their bellies. The act of eating was no longer ordinary. It was holy. Hunger had taught them silence, but food awakened voices again. Whispers floated through the barracks, voices cracking with emotion as women spoke words of gratitude or disbelief. Some tried to offer portions to others, though their shaking hands betrayed how desperately they wanted to keep every drop. Even in their weakness, the instinct to share, to show mercy to one another returned. Hunger had silenced their humanity, but food restored it. It was a reminder that even here, even in the shadow of defeat, kindness could exist. The Allied soldiers watched quietly. They did not mock, did not jeer. They had fought these women's countrymen, suffered losses at their hands, yet in this moment none of that mattered. What they saw before them was not the face of the enemy, but of suffering. The act of feeding was as much for themselves as for the prisoners. It proved that even amid the ashes of war, compassion could endure. The sight of tears running down the faces of those women, the sound of spoons clinking against bowls, was more powerful than the thunder of artillery or the crack of rifles. It was a reminder of why wars ended, of why peace had to follow, and so the women ate. They ate as though each bite was a step back from the edge of death. The bread crumbled in their hands, soft and warm against fingers that trembled too much to hold it steady. The soup filled them with life, each spoonful a promise that tomorrow would come. They knew they were prisoners still, that freedom was far away, but in that moment none of it mattered. What mattered was the food, the act of mercy, the fragile, flickering truth that survival was possible. As the last bowls were emptied and the final crumbs devoured, a hush fell over the group once again. But it was a different silence this time, not the silence of despair, but the silence of release. Their stomachs no longer twisted in agony, their throats no longer burned with hunger. Tears still clung to their faces, but they were tears that spoke of both sorrow and relief. They had crossed a threshold from emptiness into life, and they would never forget it. For them, this food was not just sustenance. It was proof that even enemies could offer grace, that even in defeat, mercy could be found. Some of the women clutched their rations as though they were holding on to the last rope, dangling over a pit of darkness. Their fingers curled so tightly around the bread and the bowls that their knuckles turned white. They didn't eat at once. Their hunger was bottomless. Their bodies screamed for nourishment, yet their minds hesitated, almost afraid that the food would be taken away as suddenly as it had been given. For them, the bread was not just bread, and the soup was not just soup. They were symbols of something larger, something their starved souls hardly dared to believe in, the possibility of survival. One woman pressed the crust of bread against her face before biting into it, inhaling the warmth, as if trying to convince herself that it was real. Another stared into the thin broth for long minutes, her tears falling into it before she finally lifted her spoon. Each action, each movement was slow, careful, deliberate. Others could not hold back. They collapsed under the weight of relief and exhaustion, devouring the food as though their lives depended on each spoonful, which in truth they did. They shook violently as they ate, soup spilling onto their clothing, dripping down their chins. Some coughed as the hot liquid burned their throats, but they kept going, their sobs merging with the sound of spoons clinking against metal. The act of eating was no longer simply an instinct. It was an explosion of emotions, the cracking of walls that hunger had built around them. They had spent days suppressing their tears, holding their pride like armor, but the food tore away those barriers in an instant. They wept openly, their shoulders quaking, their faces blotched with red from the force of their cries. Hunger had broken their bodies, but food broke their pride. The camp echoed differently now. Where before there had been silence, a silence haunted by despair, there was now a mixture of muffled sobs, whispers of thanks, and the rhythmic scrape of spoons across bowls. The wooden benches that once bore only weary bodies now trembled under women leaning forward, bent over their meals as though bowing in prayer. Some whispered words that no one else could hear, fragments of blessings, fragments of apologies to themselves, to God, to their families far away. A few crossed themselves before each spoonful, their faith rekindled by something as simple as soup. Tears rolled down faces streaked with dirt, carving clean lines down cheeks that had not felt water in days. The first few bites filled their stomachs so quickly that it almost hurt. Their bodies, so long deprived, struggled to accept the sudden flood of nourishment. But they pressed on, because each mouthful was a promise against death. Some ate slowly, savoring the taste, stretching out each bite as if to make the moment last forever. Others ate in hurried desperation, shoving food into their mouths with shaking hands, afraid that at any moment it might be snatched away, that this fragile mercy might evaporate into the cold air. And all the while tears never ceased. They cried not only because they were eating, but because of what it meant, that the nightmare of hunger had ended, even if only for a night. The sobs were layered with memories. For every taste of bread, there came the memory of a kitchen back home, of families gathered at tables that no longer existed, of warmth and laughter swallowed by war. For every spoonful of soup, there came the image of mothers, fathers, children, loved ones now gone or separated. The food revived their bodies, but awakened their grief as well, reminding them of all they had lost, of the months of agony that had preceded this fragile reprieve. The nourishment was a double-edged gift, healing and torment, comfort and reminder. It gave them strength, but it also forced them to feel again, to remember, to mourn. The Allied guards looked on from a distance, their boots planted firmly in the mud, their rifles slung across their shoulders. They were silent, perhaps unwilling to intrude on this moment, or perhaps unsure of what to feel. The sight of their former enemies, women reduced to sobbing figures over bowls of soup, was something more powerful than any battlefield encounter. There was no hatred in their eyes now, no defiance, no ideology. Just humanity, stripped bare, fragile, desperate, and unbearably real. Some guards turned away, unwilling to watch the women break down. Others could not look away, struck by the enormity of what they were witnessing. For the prisoners, the tears were a cleansing flood. They had endured so much, held back so much, buried so much beneath layers of pride and survival instinct. Now the dam had burst. Their cries rose into the air, mingling with the steam of their soup, drifting over the barbed wire and wooden posts of the camp. They were not soldiers anymore. They were not prisoners, not enemies, not symbols of a defeated regime. They were simply women, broken and remade by hunger, cradling food as though it were life itself. The sound of spoons scraping against metal became the rhythm of survival. Each scrape was proof that they were still alive, that their hands still had the strength to move, that their bodies still had the will to fight on. It was a sound of resilience, a sound of humanity clawing its way back from the edge. The sobs and prayers layered over it, creating a chorus that no one who heard it would ever forget. When the last drops were swallowed and the last crumbs vanished, the women sat quietly again. But the silence was not the silence of despair this time. It was heavy with relief, with the strange calm that follows a storm of tears. They wiped their faces with trembling hands, clutched their empty bowls to their chests, and breathed deeply, as though they were learning how to live again. The food had filled their stomachs, but the act of mercy had filled something deeper, their will to endure. And in that fragile, sacred moment, even the barbed wire seemed to fade into the background. That day in the camp, something extraordinary happened, something that could never have been predicted by anyone who had witnessed the savagery of the war. Food, so simple, so ordinary in the lives they once knew, became more powerful than the weapons that had torn nations apart. A loaf of bread carried more weight than a rifle. A bowl of broth carried more meaning than an army's march. For the women who sat there, heads bent low, faces streaked with tears, the food was not merely sustenance. It was a message, a reminder that even in the aftermath of devastation, mercy could still exist. In the silence of that camp, food spoke louder than guns. The prisoners had endured humiliation, captivity and hunger, each day a battle against despair. Their strength had been ground down until only instinct remained. Yet now, as they sat clutching their bowls, something stirred within them. For the first time in weeks, their bodies no longer trembled with the weakness of starvation, but with the shock of having life given back. Their hands shook, not from emptiness, but from the overwhelming emotion of being allowed to live another day. It was as if the act of eating had peeled away layers of suffering and revealed something deeply human beneath, something that war had tried to strip away. The Allied soldiers who watched them understood more than they let on. They had fought across continents, lost comrades, buried friends. They had seen destruction on a scale no human heart was built to endure. And yet, in this moment, they saw their former enemies in a different light. They were not the women of the enemy nation, not the faceless opposition of propaganda, but fragile beings, reduced to tears over bread and soup. For the soldiers, too, the moment carried weight. Feeding those they had fought against was not weakness, it was strength. It was proof that compassion could survive even the darkest years. The women huddled close together, bowls cradled in their arms like sacred treasures. Some leaned against each other for support, their shoulders touching, their sobs mingling. There was no hierarchy among them now, no rank or title, no separation of who had been stronger or more defiant. Hunger had made them equals, and mercy had bound them together. In those fragile bonds, the beginnings of healing could be felt. The tears they shed were not only for the end of hunger, but for everything the war had stolen, families torn apart, homes destroyed, futures erased. With every bite, they were forced to remember that they had survived while so many others had not. The camp itself seemed to shift in atmosphere. The barbed wire still surrounded them, the watchtowers still loomed overhead, the mud still clung to boots and hems. But for that fleeting moment, it was not just a place of confinement. It was a place where humanity reasserted itself, where the simple act of giving food transformed the meaning of power. The harshness of war had created walls between captor and captive, but food dissolved those walls in ways weapons never could. For the women, the memory of that day would never fade. Years later, long after the war ended, They would recall how their pride had crumbled, how their tears had flowed uncontrollably, how the warmth of bread in their hands had felt like life itself. Some would remember the kindness in the eyes of a soldier who handed them their bowl. Others would remember the way their bodies shook as they ate, the way their hearts ached as they realized they were allowed to go on living. The memory would remain raw, not because it was humiliating, but because it revealed the truth of what they had endured, that survival sometimes demanded surrender, that dignity sometimes gave way to need. What happened that day was larger than the women themselves. It was a symbol of war's strange contradictions. The same nations that had fought bitterly, that had unleashed fire and steel upon each other, could also show mercy in the quiet aftermath. The moment the women broke down over food became a moment that transcended battle lines. It showed that war, for all its cruelty, could not entirely erase the core of what makes us human, the ability to give, the ability to receive, the ability to feel compassion, even for those we once called enemies. In their weakness, the women revealed their strength. Strength not of soldiers, not of uniforms or weapons, but of human beings who endured unimaginable suffering and still found the will to live. To break down in tears was not defeat, it was survival. It was the body's way of releasing the weight of agony, the soul's way of accepting that mercy was possible. They rose from that moment changed, their spirits scarred but alive, their bodies trembling but nourished. The image of them sitting there, huddled under the grey sky, their hands wrapped tightly around bowls, tears staining their cheeks, was one of war's most haunting contradictions. Mercy amid devastation, humanity in the shadow of violence, bread and soup becoming more powerful than bullets and bombs. For those who witnessed it, the memory was indelible. For those who lived it, the memory was eternal. The camp settled into a strange calm after the sobs faded. Women leaned against walls, breathing more evenly, their bodies easing into the rare sensation of fullness. Soldiers returned to their posts, silent, perhaps reflective. The ground, littered with crumbs and drops of spilled broth, bore silent testimony to what had just occurred. It was not the noise of battle, not the chaos of conflict, but a quiet, almost sacred moment that carried the weight of something larger than war itself. When historians would later speak of battles, strategies, and victories, moments like this would seldom be mentioned. Yet for the women who broke down as they were given food after days of hunger, this moment was as significant as any clash of armies. It was the point where they discovered that survival was still possible, where they learned that mercy could come even from the hands of enemies, where they realized that the human spirit, though fragile, could still endure.